Welcome to the 11th episode of In Plain English. Before we start, I want to make sure everyone knows that there will be links to harm reduction resources in the show notes and on our website at inplainenglishpod.org. These will mostly be US specific, with some St. Louis specific ones for our local listeners. Please check out those resources and find ones that are local to you. If nothing else, please get trained in using Narcan and find out how to get some in your area so you always have it on hand. It's incredibly easy to do and could save a life. With that out of the way, let's get on to today's episode. Welcome, everyone, to the 11th episode of In Plain English, the podcast where we talk about research in terms that everyone can understand, not just the experts. I'm your host, Jamie Moffa, and today we're going to be talking about the paper What is a Situation? An Assemblic Ethnography of the Drug War by Lydon. Here to discuss the paper is our expert guest, Hilary Agro. Hilary, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks for thinking of me for this. I'm Hilary Agro. I'm a PhD candidate and anthropologist at the University of British Columbia, but I live in Toronto and I'm doing my research in Toronto. I study anti-drug war activism, so activism against prohibition and more generally drug use and, the place of consciousness alteration in human culture and society.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And joining Hilary are our two non-expert guests, Vera Thornton and Brigid Lydon. Vera and Brigid, would you each like to introduce yourselves?
So my name is Vera, and I'm an MD PhD candidate at Washington University in St. Louis. So that means that one day after a lot of training, which is still ongoing, I'm going to be a doctor who also conducts research. And my PhD is in biomedical informatics and data science. And my research area is substance use disorder and specifically what we can learn about that using big data. My current research, I'm especially looking at associations between differences in your brain and use of particularly alcohol, but other substances as well.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize our work had so much overlap.
Yeah, but I'm very much approaching it from, kind of the medical neuroimaging, neuroscience way of looking at it. So it's really interesting to read the paper that's kind of looking at this from an anthro perspective. I took one anthropology class way back in undergrad, so there's a lot about anthropology that I don't necessarily know. On the other hand, I think kind of a paper like this, perhaps people like me are some of the people that should be reading the paper and understanding it. We'll get on to some of the barriers to that in the discussion.
Yeah, I agree. And yes, there are significant barriers.
My name is Brigid Lydon. I'm currently working on an associate's at my local college, Virginia Western, and I'm also working at my library until such a time as something else comes up.
You mentioned you worked in the library. So I worked in a library for a little while, and there actually is some overlap between homelessness, substance use disorder, and libraries, because it's one of the few places in our society where you can just kind of go and be, and it's warm and not in the rain or the heat. I was in Arizona at one point. And again, people that perhaps this research should be, people should be able to access it and be aware of it. You're very much, you are working with some of the people affected by this.
I definitely see the dregs of mental health and homelessness. However, I live in a small town, so it's all very limited. However, this is a topic that I find really interesting.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to speak about it with everybody. And to be clear, I will never stop feeling like an outsider to academia, because if anybody struggled with any part of this article, I can guarantee you I probably struggled more. It's a dense one. That's kind of the point of doing this kind of thing. It's, I had a lot of questions when I first read this article. It's taken me a couple of years to really digest it every time I go back to it, because it is actually quite foundational to one part of the work that I do. I'm like, what are you talking about? And then it's hard. But when I get through it, because, that's my job is to be like, okay, no, I actually do have to do this. There are insights, but I struggle on my own. So I think that this kind of thing is really cool, because I wish that I had more people to talk to about these things. And I wish that when I read an article, I could just be like, can somebody explain this to me?
Hilary, before you hopped on the call with us, we were kind of talking about sort of this academic language and how hard it can be to understand it. And, generally when people are doing a behavior, there's a reason they're doing that, and sort of what functions might this be serving. And so mine was, perhaps one would say a bit unkind, where I was like, are they trying to make me feel like I'm not in the club?
That's a really common reaction, and it's something that really troubles me.
Yeah. And again, that for somebody who perhaps is having some bigger feelings of, do I belong in, if you didn't guess from the bioinformatics and data science, I'm really into math. And, an issue over in math is trying to make people who are, perhaps coming from different backgrounds feel welcome and feel like they can find a place in mathematics. And, difficult language can, sort of, why create this problem if you don't inherently have it, by perhaps sort of using more difficult language. And then Jamie, you mentioned one of our guests who sadly wasn't able to join us today had kind of a different take on why that language might be in the paper.
That came from my partner, who was a previous guest on this podcast, who was reading this paper with me last night and had the thought that, like, a lot of the arguments seemed like they were making very anarchist arguments about how to conduct, like, anti-drug war activism, and that perhaps part of the reason why the language was coded was because the author did not quite want to be open about, like, I'm making an anarchist argument for why.
Yeah. Well, this is such an interesting, I have so much to say about the reasons why authors use this kind of language. Yeah, so there's several reasons. It's both, but in kind of different ways than you might think. So for an article like this, I mean, I don't know Jared Zygon very well, but I also have gotten a really good sense of reading between the lines, like your partner did, for an author's political standpoint, like the lens through which they're viewing the world, because that's really important to me, and because all research is political, whether it seems like it or not. And so once you get good at reading between the lines, you can sort of start to see, like, where is this person coming from? And this is, for such a theory-dense article, this is quite a political worldview that they're taking, an argument that they're making. But the other thing is that for anthropologists in particular who work with people and do our field work among people, the choice of field site in the first place is a political choice. So Jared Zygon chose to work with people who use drugs. So I guess we should at some point say what the article is about. Jared Zygon is an anthropologist who does ethnographic work among people who are organizing against the war on drugs. And the article is about sort of framing the war on drugs as through this theoretical framework called a situation, kind of like global warming or capitalism, like this really big situation that appears all across the world and affects so many different people's lives, and that people are fighting against and trying to rectify in ways that do justice to human flourishing and well-being. That choice to do this kind of work, where he could have done the classical anthropologist thing and, like, go to Papua New Guinea and, like, study the locals and their culture. I mean, you can't really do that. It's not really acceptable to do that anymore in anthropology unless you've been doing it, unless you've been grandfathered in as somebody who has been doing that since, the 70s. You can't really start work like that anymore because we realize that it's colonialist and racist and problematic. But still, he chose to do a very political project, which means that he cares about these things and is interested in these things. And when you're doing that kind of field work, you make friends with people, you listen to people, you hear their perspectives, you empathize with them. It doesn't mean that you always agree with them politically, because there are anthropologists who work, like, with Nazis and, people that they absolutely don't agree with politically, but are trying to understand them. But you can tell that he empathizes. And so we can talk, if there's any interest, about why that's okay and doesn't make his work any less rigorous and academic. To get back to the point of the language, so yes, he is obviously coming at this from a view that the war on drugs is wrong, and that the people who are fighting it deserve the things that they're fighting for, like human dignity and autonomy. But he is also writing in an academic journal, and he's not going to get published if he is just making those arguments explicitly. And it's not to say that he's trying to be sneaky about it, but he's trying to use this theory and these insights from his fieldwork and speak the language, both in terms of the actual choices of words that he's using and the way that he's presenting this theory is very kind of like, I hate to say dry. It's a little dry considering how spicy the subject matter is, but it's, this very sort of like calm, matter-of-fact theoretical orientation, especially at the beginning, that establishes him as an authority on the subject. It does all of these things. But the reason that Vera is also right is that the reason that Jarrett Zygon has to do that is because of other authors who have set this precedent of creating this type of language that separates them from everybody else, that we're academics, we think about lofty ideals and ideas, and this is how we talk, and nobody has ever held these academics to account to say, hey, your ideas are important and the ideas themselves can be accessible to anybody, so why the fuck are you writing like this? What are you doing? Stop it. But it's tied in with white supremacy and colonialism and like class issues of these entanglements within academia that keep it being like, oh, this is our like knowledge and research, and we do this special thing that regular workers can't do, and it's not actually true. So you're both right. Jared Zygon, I don't think, is using this language on purpose to make anybody feel like a dumbass, but other authors are. And it has created a culture of this where everyone feels like they need to sound smart, and then students do the same thing.
Yeah, the accessibility of language is very interesting, even though I work with fantasy and not necessarily dense literature. It's interesting to see what people gravitate towards, and especially living in a small town where education is not exactly emphasized. It's interesting to see a translation.
Yeah, and it's language, and it's also narrative, right? Like, it's stories. The parts of this article that are couched in stories are really compelling, and they make you want to keep reading. But yeah, so we should, and there are many authors doing this, but like using that sort of like, what are people interested in? What do people read at libraries? What do they like? And it's stories. And so we should be able to use that knowledge to share these insights.
Yeah. So let's start sharing some insights from the paper.
Yeah. So what is a situation? An assemblic ethnography of the drug war. So already we have, what is an assemblic ethnography? What he's doing is he's studying the war on drugs, global drug prohibition. So right now in the world, as we know, although I like to point this out to people because of the fact that we don't want people to take for granted that this is a natural thing, we need to point out that this is a temporary situation. Many drugs are prohibited in most countries under the threat of state violence. So not all drugs, but many, many drugs. If you use them, you are at risk of violence by the state. And this risk doesn't apply to everybody equally, obviously, but that's the situation, is that governments are using violent force to make sure that people aren't producing, selling, transporting, or using certain consciousness-altering substances. And so what Zygon does is he does ethnography among people who are fighting against the situation. People who say, no, I don't like that. I don't like that I am not allowed to put what I want to inside my own body without risking an armed agent of the state assaulting me. I want to change this political situation. The reason that he's looking at this through what he calls an assemblic ethnography. So traditional ethnography is you go to one place, often for a year or more, and you do this research among people. So it's a way of researching the way anthropology began was researching culture and, the ways that people interact and local customs and everything. Now it's frequently about you work with a group of people, you see what their lives are like, You interview them, you do data collection and what's called participant observation, which is where you go and participate in the daily lives and activities of this group of people. And then you take detailed notes either when you're there or more commonly when you get home. And you just learn what it's like to live with people. So whereas many social scientific researchers will just their projects are shorter and they'll maybe interview people, but it's like a set of very specific questions, or they do surveys, so they're collecting more data. This is like a really in-depth type of data collection where you're not looking at that many people, but you're really deeply looking at all of the aspects of their lives that are being impacted by, the thing that you're studying, for example, the drug war. So that's ethnography. Assemblic ethnography, which is Zygon's thing, is saying, I could go and work with people who use heroin in San Francisco, or, harm reduction organizations in New York, or, this organization in Copenhagen, or anti-drug war activists in Vancouver. But I'm instead going to do all of that. And obviously he has the luxury of funding to be able to do that, because that's the main limitation that makes it so that people can't do that. But if you can get the funding, it's a really interesting way of doing work, because it means that you get to say, all right, how is the drug war impacting these people here? Okay, oh, that's shitty. Let's go over here. What is the drug war doing here? Oh, that's also shitty. Over here, that's a little less shitty, still shitty, but hey, it's a little better. Why is it better? What are the differences here? What are people doing? What is the political climate in which they're doing this work? And so by doing that, and he's building on a tradition in anthropology called multi-sited ethnography that's been around for years and years, where you can use those different insights from different locations to be like, all right, well, this is what the drug war looks like, and it's the same everywhere in these ways, in terms of state violence, like people who use drugs being subject to stigma and lack of access to healthcare and blah, blah, blah. But okay, it's a little better over here because, as he specifically mentions, Vancouver is one of the better places and usually touted as the best place in North America compared to these other places, which is also interesting because I know a lot of drug user activists from Vancouver, and they're all very mad all the time and they should be, because things are still really bad there. Yeah. And then, the situation is more of a theoretical orientation that he's kind of elaborating on in this. And so he's trying to say so we have this big thing, situation is actually a really good word for it. He kind of nailed it with that one, because it comes very naturally to be like the situation of the drug war. But he also uses the examples of global warming and capitalism, which are, and obviously all three of those things are deeply intertwined, where it's like, okay, if I say global warming or the climate crisis, if I say the war on drugs, if I say capitalism, most people kind of have an understanding of what that means. But none of those things are like singular physical objects. Like, we can't touch the war on drugs. We can see manifestations of the war on drugs. We can see how it impacts people, but it's not like a thing. And so this gets into some complicated sort of like more philosophical abstract theory about, what is a thing, and like what, all that stuff. But I'm actually less interested in that, because even though it's interesting, as Zygon actually points out, because he points out a couple of other authors who have tried to theorize about these big situations. But what first drew me to this article, where I was like, oh yes, speaking my language, is that he points out that when these other authors are speaking of these things in really abstract ways and saying like, well, this is a thing that can't be touched, and it's diffused across global scales, and it's the ways that these other authors are theorizing about things like climate change. Zygon asks, okay, so if this is like an untouchable object that just sort of like floats around and exists and impacts people but isn't really a thing, how do we change it? How do we get rid of it? How do we fight it? He's coming from a place of like listening to his research participants who would be like, okay, yeah, great. So you guys are theorizing about the drug war as this like ontological situation, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's still killing us. So how do we affect it? And so I like that about his approach. And he's saying, well, we're going to look at it as a situation, because a situation can be impacted by human activity.
That was something I liked, where he sort of mentioned that I'm going to look specifically at how this framework helps us break this whole thing down, so we can kind of see where, if we wanted to change it in one way or the other, where we would, where are those pressure points and where would we go? Because I've definitely had my share of academic research where I sort of read it and I'm like, okay, cool story, bro, but what do I do? What do I go and do differently in the world now?
Yes.
Because sometimes someone will have very carefully, like, and again, not to say that all research that just sort of names the problem or describes the problem is bad, but I do feel like it's leaving a piece of it unaddressed of, okay, that's terrible. What do I do? Because, especially if it's in an area where you work, it's okay, that sounds awful. I don't want to perpetuate that. What do I do? Although one thing that was interesting is, to me, the word situation, I actually had a little trouble with that. I kind of experienced that as a bit of a barrier to understanding this theoretical concept, because I think,
interesting,
in my mind, oh, that situation by the soda machine today, kind of, it's small, it's local, it is limited in place and time. So it was a little bit of the kind of extra connotations on that word didn't quite match for my particular thing. And
I actually had a similar experience with the term situation that you did, because he did throw out a bunch of other terms that define them, and some of them even are used within the paper itself. I was a little lost, and I'm like, so you're saying this is a situation, but you're also going to use this term interchangeably at some points in your paper that also refers to this same general term. So which is it?
Right, like situations and assemblages, like they felt very similar.
And there are also, like, he used hyperobject several times within the paper after he defined it.
I think that was a theory that he was actually, like, saying that he does not, like, he was comparing situations to hyperobjects.
Yeah, he was getting ahead of criticisms that would say, well, you're just describing a hyperobject, which has already been described by another author. He's saying this is similar to a hyperobject, but the way it's different is like XYZ, because academics, I noticed this interesting thing among academics for good reason, because we critique each other all the time, but it's the same kind of like anxiety that I get from having spent way too much time on Twitter, is that when you're criticized all of the time, and when there's constantly people being like, well, what about this? Did you think about this? I don't know about this. Like, that you like try to get ahead of criticism by being like, okay, hang on, I know what you're going to say. I know you're going to say this sounds like a hyperobject. However, it's different because XYZ. And so he does that with a couple of approaches. But, Brigid's right in that I think what it comes down to is that if you're going to use a term in a different way than it has been used, your definition of it better be pretty freaking clear. It better be like, oh, okay, all right, I understand what you mean by that in this paper, and blah, blah, blah. And like, maybe he could have used a term that was a little less, already defined and used. But it's true, because in his definition of a situation, he starts it by saying, by situation, I mean a non-totalizable assemblage widely diffused across blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, but now you have to define assemblage and non-totalizable. Like, it's, yeah, so it's it's a difficult thing, and I really do think that all of these things could have been said in plain English, if I may.
A follow-on question to that is, and you would know this and I would not, is, has this concept of situation been taken and used to, say, advance understanding of other concepts like capitalism or global warming? Because, I realized, I feel like some of my understanding of what is a situation was being driven by my existing understanding of what is the drug war. And it wasn't actually advancing my, and it was sort of flowing the wrong direction. Whereas ideally, when you do this big theoretical heavy lift that you're, created, all right, we defined situation, we created it to be a thing. Now I can use it to shed new light on multiple other areas. And I was sort of curious if that's come to fruition now that the term has been defined.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I had the same question when I first read this article, and I tried to find the answer and was unable to. So what I did was I emailed him directly. I asked him, this was in 2020, and I said, I'm designing my ethnographic research at the moment, and I'm planning on using your concept of the situation as one of my primary theoretical orientations. However, because it's so new, I'm having trouble finding work by other authors since your 2015 article that have built on this useful theory. Because I liked the article, and I could tell that this author, like, I'm very interested in his work and everything. So I was very like anxious about asking this in a way that was very like, I'm genuinely curious. I tried to find other stuff, but it's really new. Is there anything else out there? And he was really nice in his answer. And he said that, at this point, it's been mostly like graduate students who are engaging it to various degrees in their dissertations, which is exactly what I'm doing. So it's still probably a fairly new concept in terms of how and where it's being used. But it's interesting because that makes it really difficult, because once a concept has kind of like percolated around and different people are using it in different ways, it's almost like the definition, like the working definition becomes like a Venn diagram of everybody's different work on this concept. And the bigger the Venn diagram is, with the more circles representing different people's interpretation and use of this concept, the clearer that definition becomes in the middle. So we have a really clear definition by now of things like racism. And, well, I mean, it's a contentious statement, but like it's easier to teach people about things like structural violence, or, what is a commodity, or, there's certain terms that have been like, are sort of like well-trodden ground.
One question I actually had is, when he introduces the notion of situation, he's very clear about this is global, this is the whole world, it involves, far-flung places. But the places that I caught being mentioned were Vancouver, New York City, somewhere in Russia, and Copenhagen were there. And I was sort of, that's actually a kind of, North American, European, white sample of what is going on here. And there were some, how well do you think he really did it truly incorporating perspectives of how, say, a, poppy grower in Afghanistan might experience this?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point to make, and I think it's a valid criticism. But where I always go with this kind of criticism is that I don't see that. I see that as a valid criticism of a system that underfunds research, and not a criticism of a researcher themselves in particular, because he could definitely do that if he had enough money to do it, right?
True, yeah.
He was probably limited with his funds. There's also sort of other things like, he could go to Rwanda and like study what's going on there. Does he know anybody there? Does he have contacts there? He could do that, but he'd probably have to spend way more time there, getting in touch with people there and developing rapport with people there. Whereas maybe he already knew people in New York and Copenhagen and those places. There's also a language barrier. So does he speak the local language of the place that he would like to study? Does he have to hire an interpreter? So that's more money. That's really kind of a big one, and that's the one that I always like to come back to and remind people of, and this is something that I talk about in my social media work a lot, is that we could fund so much research. Like, people have no idea how much money is just floating out there on fucking billionaire yachts that we could be putting into research. Another limitation is that it's one person. It takes time. So like, he might be continuing this research. He could be in Tanzania right now, for all I know, doing this kind of thing. But ethnography takes a lot of time.
Well, and again, you need to have a certain level of language and cultural understanding to begin to do that work.
Especially to do it in ways that aren't harmful, because anthropologists have a terrible history of harming the people that they're doing research among.
It's pinging off of one, though, that I see more on kind of the biomedical side of research, of sort of basically when you do the research that's easy to do because of your existing connections and because of the funding you have, you end up with kind of a convenience sample of, what was immediately accessible to you. And the convenience samples tend to not challenge your worldview perhaps as much as they should. And that there's a real imbalance in terms of, let's see, white people who are substance use disorders are vastly overstudied in comparison to like everybody else. And it is a real problem. And it's one of, and again, a problem with research I'm working on now. At the same time, it's sort of any piece of research that comes across, I'm going to say, well, are we perpetuating the problem or challenging the problem in kind of that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing I always want to make sure that people understand when we're talking about these issues is we have this tendency because capitalists want us to think this way, that there's only so much money and there's like, we just have only this much, so we can only fund so many research projects and like we can only do, and like, no, there is just like so much money out there. It's just going to the wrong places. Anyways, so the article.
Yeah, so back to the article. I was like, what's a biopolitical therapeutic?
That one.
Was that the one that you mentioned that like
that we were I again as someone who works in biomedical therapeutics, I'm like, maybe I should know what this is, but I sure don't.
So Jarrett traced the assemblic relations and their differential distribution to Denpasar and back again to Russia when the aspect of biopolitical therapeutics revealed itself. So biopolitics is it's not an area that I'm like super knowledgeable about. I want to say it was like Foucault who started this, but whoever's listening to this and knows that I may be wrong about that, feel free to let us know in the comments when you post this who originated biopolitics. I think it was Foucault. Anyways, so it's the idea of politics, but like via biology. And so like an example of biopolitics is actually vaccines are a good one. So like you would think that vaccines are just a medical thing. It's like, yeah, this is yay, medical innovation and like cool. And like this is theoretically should just be this is health-based and it's biological, it's medical, but it's not. It's biopolitical because vaccines are a very political issue because it's like, are we making people take them? Who does want to take them? Who doesn't want to take them? Who has access to them? There are all sorts of political questions that come up when you're thinking about biomedical issues. And I think it's really important. And I think this pandemic has actually been like a huge wake up call for a lot of biomedical researchers who previously thought like, if I just do really good research and like make the good vaccine, like, yay, it'll solve the problem. And then they just watched with horror as it's like, oh God, oh no, oh, this is bad. And this is all political issues. And so I think more biomedical researchers need to understand biopolitics in order to understand what we need to do about this. But it's a big thing in harm reduction as well, because when you think about stuff, when you think about harm reduction from a strictly biomedical approach, you're thinking about things like needle exchanges and, like HIV and hepatitis prevention and preventing abscesses and preventing, like harm reduction is to prevent mostly sort of like harm to the body. But if you think about it in a purely biomedical sense, you think like, okay, well, if we just give people needles and like, yay. But that's only half of the problem, because how do people access the needles? Like how do people access the knowledge to use these things? How do they, there's all sorts of political problems that get in the way. So, and then there's also like the biopolitics of control. So there's things like, all right, fine, we'll give people access to needles, but like you have to, actually, it's a great example. Methadone. So for those who don't know, methadone is a really commonly prescribed substance for people who use heroin or other opioids in chaotic ways. And they're either through their own choice because they just want to have this drug, or they're forced by various programs and carceral mentalities that they take methadone, and you just take it once a day and it's like really long lasting. And, for some people, this is really ideal because instead of having to like re-up on heroin like 3 or 4 times a day, they just take their methadone once a day, and it keeps them, it keeps them going, and it manages their pain, and it's good. But for other people, this is a biopolitical trap. It's a cage, because for a lot of people who take it, they don't get to just take home a month's supply and take their it's a liquid. They don't get to just take it, keep it in their fridge and take it once a day. We don't trust them to do that. They have to go to a pharmacy and pick it up every single day. So if you're listening to this, I want you to imagine that there is a drug that you depend on to survive, and every day you have to go pick it up from a pharmacy. What would that make your life look like? You can't go out of town. You can't you have to organize your entire schedule every day on making sure that you have access to this one location. You know, it's chains. It keeps people trapped. And so obviously they're not able, like, what if they're trying to apply for a job and the job interview is at 9 a.m., but the pharmacy doesn't open till 9:15. So now they have to decide between going to the job interview while potentially sick or missing this job interview. The way that we control the lives of people who use drugs, even when we're not putting them in jail, is this is biopolitics. And so biopolitical therapeutics, I would imagine in this article, is kind of looking at that same thing, like,
and again, underlining that, you know, some of the research I do kind of looks at, treatments like methadone, they exist, they're effective in terms of preventing overdoses and death, and yet they're very, very underprescribed. So I would, again, I'd say this probably is a concept I should know, and has not made it successfully from anthropology into over where I'm working as much as it should have, perhaps.
Yeah, so I would imagine that the way that he's using it is actually pretty similar to the way that we're talking about with methadone. So like it's a therapeutic is like kind of, I've seen that term come up in this kind of stuff, and it's like a drug or a therapeutic intervention on people's health. That's good, but it's biopolitical because well, everything is political, but some are more than others. Like alcohol is a less politicized substance than Suboxone, so or heroin. So I would imagine the biopolitical therapeutics is kind of things like methadone or maybe even Narcan, naloxone, which for anyone who doesn't know is an incredibly effective, very, very safe drug that stops opioid overdoses from happening. And so everybody should know how to use Narcan, get Narcan, carry it on you. It saves lives. It's one of the most incredible drugs that's ever been developed. That's a biopolitical therapeutic.
And yeah, just for anyone who's interested, I know at least a lot of the Midwest states around me have an open prescription, which means that if you go to any pharmacy, you can get this and you can carry it in your car or in your bag, because you never know when you're going to be walking up a sidewalk and there's someone laying there.
Yeah, many lives have been saved just by people being like, okay, I guess I'll keep one of these in my car. Learn how to use it. If you can get the nasal spray, that's good, because you barely even have to know how to use it.
It's very easy to use, and I don't believe there's any particular side. If, for instance, you're unsure about why someone is unconscious, be careful, look for other injuries, but also I don't think you'd harm them by administering this.
Yes, yeah, it's harmless. There's online training that you can take. It's very fast. You can go to, I don't know if it's like naloxone.com or something. You can just Google like naloxone online training. It's super easy. The most important thing to know how to do is like sort of basic CPR. You need to be giving them chest compressions as you're also because you administer another naloxone every 5 minutes or something like that. If the first one didn't work, you got to just keep their heart pumping to minimize brain damage. But it's really easy. And I also just want to make sure that everybody understands that you cannot overdose from touching a drug. Every time that you read cops talking about overdosing from getting fentanyl on their skin, they're lying. You think that I'm exaggerating and being like, no, surely the cops wouldn't lie about something so easily disproven. No, yeah, they are lying. You cannot you cannot overdose from getting drugs on specifically fentanyl on your skin. That is not a thing that happens. And so what they're trying to do is they're scaring people away from, they're both justifying their own unwillingness to intervene and save people's lives with naloxone, but they're also scaring the public away from saving other people's lives. Because if you see somebody like overdosed on fentanyl and you're like, oh God, like, but I don't want to touch them. Like, what if they have drugs on them and then also overdose? Like, that's not a thing.
If you're very, very concerned, plastic gloves take like no space to carry, and
they fit inside a naloxone kit. A lot of them come with it.
And again, if you're worried about someone being injured and say blood, again, gloves.
So through my work, I do a lot of this kind of like harm reduction, educational work. And I just want to point out the sort of like politics behind doing the kind of work that I do, because every time that I TA a class, I introduce myself to the class and then I give them a little harm reduction spiel. I say, if you want to learn how to take naloxone, I can train you. I run trainings sometimes at school. I used to when I lived in Vancouver, but I do everything remotely now. But like I can train people. I can give you any information. I can answer any questions. I'm like super open. Like everything. My office is a safe space. My like online office hours are a safe space. People can always DM me, you know, if you have questions about drugs, because I would rather people get their information about drugs from reputable sources than like from their friends or whatever. And I have encountered weird resistance and fear among the professors that I TA for. Not all of them, but some of them are really uncomfortable with the fact that I'm talking about this in the class. They're worried that they'll get in trouble for letting me say these things to students. They have no idea what the rules are around, am I encouraging drug use? Or like, and this is because this entire culture of fear that surrounds drug use makes it so that even regular people who want to do good are like, yeah, but am I going to get in trouble? Am I going to overdose? If I take my friend to the hospital, am I going to get arrested? And that is one of the things that Zygon is talking about in this article when he talks about a situation. So it's not just people getting arrested for drugs, it's people being too afraid of these state consequences and even just sort of like career consequences or stigma, being afraid to stand up, being afraid to do the right thing, being afraid to help somebody and or speak up. And this could apply to all sorts of different stuff. When a situation like this, a harmful, violent situation, is kept going with these kind of affects of fear and threat and control, like that's a really big reason that these things function, is keeping us all too afraid to do and say the right thing. And there are consequences sometimes. I had somebody call Child Protective Services on me because of the work that I do, and put myself and my children at risk, and did great harm to my family. Obviously, they came, they did a whole check, they checked out the apartment, they had to look at the kids and everything, and they were like, oh, okay, well, this was obviously fraudulent, and it was just based on somebody that I made angry with my political work, who wanted to harm me, and it worked, but it didn't work to silence me or stop talking about these issues. But this is exactly the kind of thing that happens to researchers who speak up and do things in ways that are outside of the normal way of doing things, because the normal way of doing things is writing articles about it. And as wonderful as those articles are, if you're not also like rattling cages, then you're not actually helping. This isn't a call out of Jarrett Zygon. His work is great, and I'm fairly confident that he probably does some activism work as well.
He may have chosen, we actually are thinking perhaps he may have chosen to not talk as deeply about that activism work because of maybe some of these concerns and sort of not wanting to cross that with his academic identity.
And it could be that this is just not the place for it. Not every academic who does this work in their personal life mixes it with their academic work. But I think that's an interesting question too, is like, why not? Is it because it would look like it would delegitimize the work that he does? In that case, that's not good, because it should further legitimize your work to say, oh no, I'm also actively fighting against harm in material ways.
It sort of gets into sort of a objective versus subjective thing of sometimes to claim that I'm being so objective about this problem means that you have to kind of hide any ways that you've experienced it or been affected by it. Yet, on the other hand, perhaps, how can you really think about this and write about this if you're just totally divorced from what's going on?
Yeah. That's my favorite topic to think about, because there's actually a little nascent growing movement within anthropology and social science in general that is looking at that specific question when it comes to drugs. So you'll notice, I could be wrong because I haven't read the article in a while, and you folks just did, so tell me if I'm wrong. Does Jarrett Zygon at any point in this article mention his own use of any drug?
No.
Okay, so that's standard practice. Most of the time, researchers don't mention their own drug use unless it's like alcohol use at a bar with their participants, or the other thing that is the other sort of like legitimized area of drug use is if you're a researcher who works in the Amazon, then you can do ayahuasca and talk about it. But if you're a researcher who studies heroin, you better not say that you use heroin. If you're a researcher who studies like rave drugs, like myself, better not say that, because it, among people who are still like rooted in drug stigma, that comes with a lot of potential professional and even legal consequences. Like there's an article that was written about a professor who was fired because he said that he used heroin during his research. Now, that was a while ago. That we now have people like Carl Hart.
I know this book, yes.
Dr. Carl Hart. So this book just came, it's called Drug Use for Grown-Ups, and it Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. It just came out a couple years ago, or maybe a year ago. And in it, he talks about his own drug use, including heroin. And he's a well-respected scientist. And there is a growing movement of people being like, we shouldn't have to hide this stuff, because not only is it continuing to harm people who use criminalized drugs, because we're creating this environment where it looks like, oh, only those people use drugs, when everybody uses drugs. Everyone's on coffee all the time, and coffee's a drug. And actually, usually I start my talks, and when I'm doing public speaking, I start my talks by asking who here didn't do any drugs today, and people's hands raise, and I remind people coffee is a drug, for the record, and then some hands lower. But yeah, so there is this thing where it's like people have lived experience, but we're not allowed to talk about it because of professional consequences and stigma and all that kind of thing. But it makes for worse research, and it means that we're just perpetuating the very same structures of oppression that we're trying to dismantle. So
I think what would be interesting for me to talk about in the last 10 minutes then would be talking about what they're doing in Vancouver, because we mentioned it earlier as an example of a better space to be someone who uses drugs, and I think it could be illustrative of the kind of work that Jarrett is trying to do and bring to the forefront to talk about what it is that they're doing there.
Yeah. So, and in my notes when I was reading this article, I thought it was really interesting the way that that he describes it as a model and inspiration for anti-drug war agonists around the globe. And this is true. People often cite Vancouver, also Portugal. Now that Portugal has decriminalized all drugs, they go to that as like, well, look what they're doing there. And it's true. Actually, BC just decriminalized drugs, so they're working on that now. So that, like, for personal possession, which is like a good step, not far enough. Generally, what looks better in Vancouver than other places is they have safe injection sites, like safe consumption sites, places where people can go use drugs, where there's like nurses and medical staff around in case of an overdose. They can get help injecting, which is often a thing. Like if somebody has been using an injection drug for a long time, it can be difficult to find places on themselves where they can inject themselves easily. See, this is another interesting thing. All of this stuff is entangled, because this, for example, becomes a feminist issue also, because sometimes there are women that stay with abusive partners because it's the only way they can get somebody to help them inject their drug. And if they had access to a safe place to where somebody else with like medical training could help them, then they would have the autonomy to be able to not rely on other people or have to get themselves into vulnerable situations in order to stay safe and not sick. But so Vancouver provides those spaces. It generally is seen as having like better services. Obviously, there's socialized healthcare in Canada, which is like a really big thing, and big part of the reason that any of this stuff exists is that right now, if a person overdoses, that causes stress on the healthcare system. I mean, I shouldn't even describe it that way, but it's our healthcare system takes care of everybody, not entirely equally, but obviously more than any for-profit system. And so if people are overdosing at really high rates, then we are at least able to a little bit more closely look at solutions and say, okay, well, this is going to save us, even if the fucking lives saved isn't enough to motivate people to support these things, because usually it's not, because drug users are so dehumanized. At least we can make an economic argument, which I hate doing, but like it's also true. It costs way less to give people clean needles and access to a safe supply of the drug they want to use than to be treating people for overdose and all of this other stuff. So Generally speaking, harm reduction there is more advanced than in other places, but I do want to really acknowledge, and as Zygon does in this article as well, that this is not just because of the sort of like structural supports around public health and that kind of thing that exist in Vancouver, and because of the more left-leaning political orientation of people in Vancouver and BC, which is like generally true compared to like, you know, Alabama or even New York. But it's also because it is has long been a location of drug user activism, and people have fought very, very hard for every single service that exists there. Every safe injection site that exists in the world, including the one in Vancouver, the really famous one, Insight, started as an illegal safe injection site. Every single one. Not one of them was made by going through official channels, by applying for government whatever. People just set up and said, we're going to do this. Fuck you, come arrest us if you don't want it to happen. And so this direct action, this civil disobedience, uncivil disobedience is another term I'm kind of taking some interest in. And that is the reason it has happened. It's always activists doing this work. It's always people just fighting for what they know is right. And eventually the cops were kind of like, well, I guess we'll just leave you alone. And then it became sanctioned. The same thing happened in Toronto with the Moss Park site. They just set up, they made a big deal out of it in the media, which is also a really good thing. You say, hey folks, we're going to help people live. The cops might come get us. Let's see what will happen. And if people are generally supportive of these things, then it looks bad for the cops to shut it down, and so they don't. And so this kind of stuff has been tried in other places, but sometimes the cops just shut it down, or sometimes people are just so there's so much oppression and violence happening that people can't get the resources to even begin and get organized. That's the kind of situation for injection drug users in most places in the world, is that they're so heavily demonized and hunted and oppressed that they can't even get access to enough needles and a tent in order to set up these things. Sometimes it happens, but it's underground because they don't want attention, because they know it'll get shut down. Generally speaking, that's why Vancouver has been luckier than elsewhere.
Having read this paper, how do you see the concepts, or maybe pick a concept from it, like interacting with your own life? Because I think it's really important to like bring this home and ground it in like things that you see or that you do or that you want to do.
That's a great question. And I like that you're asking about sort of like everyday life instead of research, because I have the way that this, you know, theoretical orientation has influenced how I think about my research. But in terms of your life, the reason I am so motivated for people to understand theory is that once you understand it, you do see it in your life, and it makes sense and makes things click in ways that didn't before. I think actually I'm gonna answer this question not personally, because I can't talk about that kind of stuff, but I think that if people are thinking about it in terms of their lives, every time you do a substance that alters your consciousness, I think it's worth thinking about the larger structures that either enable you to do that substance safely. You know, you have access to coffee on every corner store. You have access to alcohol. And every time you buy alcohol, if you buy a bottle, you know the percentage of alcohol that's in it, you know what it's made out of, you know it was manufactured safely. There are regulations and rules ensuring that it's manufactured safely, and you don't drink a beer thinking that you're going to overdose on that beer. Most people who use other drugs do not have that same luxury. And so to think about the global situation that has led to some drug users having access to a safe supply, and other drug users, every time they use their drug, they either have to like go through this whole song and dance of like testing and dosing and all this stuff to try to ensure that they have safe access, or, you know, the most marginalized people just have to hope, and then they do it and they overdose and sometimes die. And that is a political choice that we are all making as a society, to allow certain people to use drugs safely and certain people to not. And all of these things are connected, and it's connected in ways that I think a lot of people don't even realize, in terms of the carceral state, the prison industrial complex, systemic racism. You know, it's usually the most marginalized people. It's Black communities, it's Indigenous communities, it's queer communities. These are the communities that are the most heavily policed and criminalized. And the reason underlying most of the sort of like rationale that is given a lot of the time, especially in Black communities in particular, is the war on drugs, and the way that the war on drugs is portrayed as a functional thing in our society, as a necessary thing, as a we need to control other people's drug use, because if not, then they're just gonna go wild and like bad things will happen, and we can't just let people use meth, we can't just let people use heroin. No, yeah, actually we can, because if we want to stop them from doing those drugs, then there are better ways of doing that. And the war on drugs is not effective for anything that it claims to be. It's only effective in terms of making money for a whole bunch of people and as a tool of social control. So yeah, that's how I see it impacting sort of like the day-to-day lives of people.
Same question briefly to Brigid and Vera. How do the concepts in this paper, like, how do you see them relating to your own lives?
Part of the reason I was interested to read this paper and come discuss is because I work over in a lot of the research I do impacts on, substance use disorder. How does it change your physiology? How does it impact kind of health? And, I think it's really important. It's just important to be aware of, again, that this isn't just sort of a biology question. And once we understand the biology, we're done. And sort of seeing how that impacts in the bigger world, or that, we've figured out this great treatment, with methadone or one of the other drugs that can be used to treat these substance use disorders. And, provided the person wants treatment, but let's say they do, okay, I wrote a prescription. Are we done now? No. And there's all these other, factors and forces going into, first, whether the person wants that prescription. And then secondly, whether they're actually able to make use of that if they choose to, change their use. Again, like the reason I think I was commenting on, how the paper was sort of tough to read so much is because I do think that should be more, in an ideal world, I think there'd be more crosstalk between, what's happening over here in, neuroscience or, genetics, and then what's happening in anthropology, and some of the difficulty of understanding is preventing that.
And once again, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's a more difficult fix, but the only real actual fix is like giving people who work in these disciplines the time, space, and money to be able to have these conversations, because like every researcher I know is like fully stressed to the max, is overworked, like has very little time to be like, it would be cool to like do a thing where we like teach each other how to write in ways that are accessible to each other, and I know most researchers want to do this kind of thing, but when we continue to place the onus on the individual to sort of like in that neoliberal self-improvement sense of, like just take this course and like, take this workshop and like, oh yeah, do this and that. And they're placing the onus on us to become better little individual units of knowledge production and dissemination, without being like, and we'll also give you 3 months off to do this, and we will also allow you to teach less so that you have time to do this. Like this support isn't there.
And then finally, Brigid, what were your thoughts?
Because I live in a very impoverished and drug-riddled community, I think it's important to learn about safe usage and policies for safe usage. Also, as someone who works in the library, I do deal with people who are both on and off drugs frequently and infrequently, so it's how can we help those people from our position, things that we can do. So this paper was a good jumping off point for basic policies that could be implemented but just aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for joining me. And Hilary, I know you mentioned that you have a Twitter and a TikTok. Do you want to share where people can find you on those?
So yeah, I'm Hilary Agro on both Twitter and TikTok, just HILARY AGRO. I do public education work there, more on TikTok than Twitter these days, because it's more fun, and Twitter is a hellhole that's bad for your mental health. So that's where I'm doing most of my work these days. But yeah, and I just wanted to mention one last little thing, because I was actually thinking about this question of like where you see these ideas being useful in regular life, and I think actually the most useful thing of looking at a situation like this in terms of like its vast scales is building solidarity. Because if you think that your problems are just your own and just in your location, or just affecting, you know, this handful of people, then it's hard to really understand the scale of the problem, and to realize that when we have problems in common with people in other places, then we can fight together, and we can build solidarity, and we can build networks of people who have the same fights. We can learn from each other what works and what doesn't. You know, we can say, what did you encounter here? Oh, like that's interesting. We could try that here. And we build networks of mutual aid, in terms of, like, you know, there's some people who are living in really isolated environments that if we had the resources to pull together and reach out to them, then we could, you know, take some of those resources and help them in those areas as well. Like in like rural areas are often really underserved areas for harm reduction, and everything gets pushed into the cities. But yeah, so just in terms of building solidarity and realizing, like, oh no, we're not alone. This is affecting all of us, and we could all fight together. And that also is kind of a relief, because it means that you don't have to fight everything on your own, and you can just take a little piece of the fight, as long as we're all doing it. And this applies to capitalism and global warming as well, where we don't have to solve it on our own. We don't have to sit with that weight of responsibility. We can just say, okay, I'm going to take my piece and keep fighting for the rest of my life in ways that are sustainable. But the more people realize how collective this all is, the less work it is for those of us that are doing the work. So,
well, I think that is a great place and a great message to end on. Thank you all for being on this episode. I think it was a really great discussion, and I hope that you all did too.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thanks so much.
It was really interesting. It was great to learn from everyone.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the 11th episode of In Plain English. We have been discussing the paper What is a Situation? An Assemblic Ethnography of the Drug War by Jarrett Zygon. Our expert for this episode was Hilary Agro, and our guests were Brigid Lydon and Vera Thornton. As always, you can find this paper for free to download on our website at inplainenglishpod.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Plain English Sci. That's PLAINENGLISHSCI. Make sure to subscribe to In Plain English on Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. And you can become a supporter of this podcast on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and tune in next month for another episode of In Plain English.